What if the life you're living right now is only a fraction of what's actually possible for you? What if everything you've achieved, every goal you've reached, every version of yourself you've become is just the tip of an iceberg of potential that remains largely untapped? Right now, there's a version of you that exists in potential, a you that's more creative, more capable, more alive, more fulfilled than the you that's currently showing up in your life. This isn't motivational fantasy. It's demonstrable reality. Neuroscience confirms that you're using only a small percentage of your brain's capacity. Psychology reveals that most people operate from a narrow range of their personality spectrum. Human potential researchers have documented that the gap between where most people are and what they're capable of is vast and largely unexplored. But here's the truth that changes everything. The reason you're not accessing this potential isn't because you lack ability, discipline, or opportunity. It's because you're trapped in invisible prisons that you don't even realize exist. You're living in self-imposed limitations that feel like reality, but are actually just beliefs, habits, and patterns that can be changed. You're operating from outdated programming that was installed when you were too young to question it and has been running your life ever since. The liberation method isn't about adding more to your life, acquiring new skills, or achieving bigger goals. It's about removing the obstacles that prevent your natural potential from expressing itself. It's about dismantling the internal barriers that keep you small, safe, and stuck. It's about breaking free from the invisible chains so that who you're truly capable of being can finally emerge. And today, you're going to learn exactly how to liberate yourself from every limitation that's been holding you back. Chapter 1: The Invisible Cage. Most people spend their entire lives inside a cage they can't see. The bars are made of beliefs they never questioned, assumptions they inherited, and conclusions they drew about themselves and the world based on limited and often painful early experiences. These bars are completely invisible because they've been there so long that they seem like reality itself rather than just one possible way of interpreting reality. You don't think, "I'm trapped by my beliefs." You think, "This is just how things are. This is just who I am. This is just what's possible for someone like me." This invisible cage is constructed gradually, starting in childhood when your brain is most impressionable and least capable of critical thinking. Every time an adult told you what you could or couldn't do, every time you tried something and failed, every time you were praised or punished, your young mind drew conclusions. "I'm good at this. I'm bad at that. This is safe. That's dangerous. People like me succeed here. People like me fail there." These conclusions form the bars of your cage, defining the boundaries of what you believe is possible for you. The insidious part is that these beliefs are self-fulfilling. Once you believe you're not creative, you stop engaging in creative activities, which means you never develop creative skills, which confirms your belief that you're not creative. Once you believe you're bad at relationships, you approach them with anxiety and defensiveness, which creates exactly the problems you're trying to avoid, which confirms your belief. Once you believe you're not capable of significant success, you don't pursue ambitious goals, which means you never achieve significant success, which confirms your belief. The cage perpetuates itself through your behavior. Dr. Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness reveals how quickly and powerfully these limitations can be installed. In his famous experiments, dogs who experienced inescapable shocks eventually stopped trying to escape even when escape became possible. They learned that their actions didn't matter, that they were helpless, and this learning generalized to new situations where they actually did have control. Human beings do the same thing. A few experiences of failure, rejection, or powerlessness can create generalized beliefs about helplessness that prevent you from even trying in situations where success is genuinely possible. But it's not just negative experiences that create the cage. Positive reinforcement in narrow areas can also limit you by creating an identity around specific capabilities while implicitly defining you as incapable in other areas. If you were praised exclusively for academic achievement, you might have developed the belief that your worth lies only in intellectual performance while feeling inadequate in social, creative, or physical domains. If you were rewarded for being helpful and accommodating, you might have developed an identity as a caretaker while suppressing your own needs and desires. The cage is as much about what you learn to excel at as what you learn to avoid. Cultural conditioning adds another layer of bars to the cage. Your society, family, religious background, and socioeconomic context all come with prescribed limitations about what's possible, appropriate, or realistic for someone of your gender, ethnicity, class, or background. These limitations are rarely stated explicitly as restrictions. They're communicated through what you see modeled, what's encouraged or discouraged, what's celebrated or criticized. You absorb them without conscious awareness, and they become part of the invisible architecture that defines your sense of possibility. The media you consume constantly reinforces certain narratives about what's normal, possible, or required for different types of people. Advertising creates artificial needs and standards. Entertainment presents distorted pictures of reality that shape your expectations. Social media creates comparison traps where you're constantly measuring yourself against curated highlight reels of others' lives. News media focuses on threats and problems, creating a sense that the world is more dangerous than it actually is. All of this input shapes the walls of your cage, defining what you believe is realistic, safe, or achievable. Perhaps the most limiting bars in the cage are the ones you've constructed yourself through your self-concept. This is the story you tell yourself about who you are, what you're capable of, what you deserve, and what's possible for someone like you. This self-concept was formed through interpretation of your experiences rather than being an objective truth about you. But once formed, it becomes the lens through which you view everything. You don't see reality. You see your self-concept's interpretation of reality. And this interpretation is almost always more limited than actual reality. The tragedy is that most people never question this cage. They accept it as just how things are. They experience the bars as solid reality rather than as malleable beliefs. They organize their entire lives around staying safely inside the cage rather than testing whether the bars are actually solid or questioning whether the cage is even necessary. They achieve a certain level of success within their self-imposed limitations and call it their potential, never realizing that they've only explored a tiny fraction of what they're actually capable of. But the cage isn't real. The bars are made of thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations, not of solid matter. They exist only in your mind, maintained only by your continued belief in them. The moment you recognize this, the moment you understand that your limitations are constructed rather than inherent, everything changes. You're not trapped by reality. You're trapped by your interpretation of reality. And interpretations can be questioned, challenged, and changed. This recognition is the first step in the liberation method, seeing the cage clearly enough to realize it was never actually locked. You've been free all along. You just didn't know it. Chapter 2. The nature of human potential. Human potential isn't a fixed quantity that you either have or don't have. It's more like a vast, largely unmapped territory that most people explore only the tiniest fraction of. Think of it like this. If your potential were represented by a continent, most people spend their entire lives in one small village, never venturing beyond its borders, never discovering the mountains, oceans, forests, and cities that exist just beyond where they've allowed themselves to go. They're not staying in the village because that's all that exists. They're staying because they believe that's all that exists, or because venturing beyond feels too risky, or because they've never questioned whether more is available. Neuroscience has revealed something extraordinary about the human brain. It's neuroplastic, meaning it can literally rewire itself throughout your entire life based on how you use it. For decades, scientists believed that your brain structure was essentially fixed after childhood, that you were stuck with whatever neural architecture you developed early on. But research over the past few decades has completely overturned this belief. Your brain is constantly reorganizing itself in response to your experiences, behaviors, and mental activity. This means that capabilities you don't currently have can be developed. Patterns that currently limit you can be rewired. The person you are now is not the person you have to remain. Dr. Carol Dweck's groundbreaking research on mindset reveals that your beliefs about whether your abilities are fixed or developable have profound effects on what you actually achieve. People with a fixed mindset believe that intelligence, talent, and capability are inherent traits that you either have or don't have. This belief causes them to avoid challenges where they might fail, to give up quickly when things get difficult, and to see effort as a sign of inadequacy rather than a path to mastery. People with a growth mindset believe that abilities can be developed through dedication and practice. This belief causes them to embrace challenges, persist through difficulties, and view effort as necessary for growth. The remarkable finding is that mindset itself affects outcomes more powerfully than initial ability does. But even growth mindset thinking often underestimates human potential because it focuses on developing specific skills rather than recognizing the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. You're not just a collection of abilities and traits. You're consciousness, awareness, the capacity to experience and respond to life. This consciousness is far more fluid, creative, and capable than any fixed notion of personality or ability suggests. When you identify primarily with consciousness rather than with any particular expression of it, you realize that you can access and develop capacities that seemed completely foreign to your personality as you've known it. Think about the extreme examples of human potential that occasionally emerge. People who learn new languages fluently in months instead of years. Athletes who achieve performances that redefine what the human body can do. Artists who create at levels that seem superhuman. Entrepreneurs who build massive enterprises from nothing. Activists who change entire social systems. Meditators who demonstrate extraordinary control over supposedly involuntary physiological processes. These aren't different species of human with different biology. They're people who, for various reasons, manage to access more of their potential than most people do. They broke through the limitations that keep most people operating at a fraction of capacity. What's common among these high performers isn't necessarily superior genetics or lucky circumstances. It's usually some combination of circumstances that prevented them from internalizing normal limitations or experiences that shattered their existing limitations, or intentional practices that systematically expanded their sense of what's possible. They somehow avoided or overcame the cage that constrains most people. And what they've accessed is available, in principle, to anyone willing to do the same work of liberation. Abraham Maslow studied what he called self-actualizing people, individuals who were living at unusually high levels of psychological health and using more of their potential. He found that these people shared certain characteristics. They were reality-focused, rather than living primarily in their heads. They were accepting of themselves and others. They were spontaneous and natural rather than performing. They were focused on problems outside themselves rather than primarily self-concerned. They needed privacy and independence. They had fresh rather than stereotyped appreciation of life. They had peak experiences of transcendence. They identified with all humanity rather than only their in-group. They had deep relationships with a few people rather than superficial relationships with many. They had democratic rather than authoritarian values. They distinguished means from ends. They had philosophical rather than hostile senses of humor. They were creative, and they resisted enculturation, meaning they didn't automatically accept cultural norms, but evaluated them critically. These characteristics aren't superhuman. They're simply what emerges when the normal constraints on human development are removed or transcended. The remarkable thing is how rare these characteristics are, not because they're difficult to develop, but because most people never question the constraints that prevent them from emerging. Self-actualization isn't about achieving something extraordinary. It's about removing the obstacles to your natural development so that what's inherently possible can manifest. Your potential also isn't just about personal achievement or capability. It includes your capacity for consciousness itself, for presence, for love, for creativity, for contribution, for joy. These aren't skills you develop. They're aspects of your fundamental nature that are usually obscured by layers of conditioning, fear, and limiting identity. Liberation isn't about becoming more than you are. It's about removing what prevents you from being what you already are at your core. Understanding the true nature of human potential shifts your entire approach to personal development. You stop asking, "How can I become better?" and start asking, "What's preventing my natural capacity from expressing itself?" You stop trying to add more skills, achievements, or qualities to yourself and start subtracting the limitations that constrain your natural expression. You recognize that you're not broken and don't need fixing. You're limited and need liberating. This shift from improvement to liberation is the essence of the method you're learning. Chapter 3: Breaking the Belief Barrier. Beliefs are the primary mechanism by which potential is either unlocked or constrained. They're not just passive opinions about how things are. They're active filters that determine what you perceive, what you attempt, how you interpret your experiences, and ultimately what becomes possible in your life. Limiting beliefs are the strongest bars in your invisible cage, and breaking through them is the most powerful form of liberation available to you. The challenge with beliefs is that they don't feel like beliefs. They feel like facts. When you believe, I'm not good at public speaking. You're not experiencing this as an interpretation or opinion. You're experiencing it as an obvious truth about yourself, confirmed by your felt sense of anxiety when you think about speaking publicly and by memories of times when speaking went poorly. The belief has been reinforced so many times through confirmation bias and self-fulfilling prophecy that it seems unquestionable. But every limiting belief, no matter how true it feels, is actually just a conclusion you drew based on limited information, usually from early in your life, when you had neither the experience nor the cognitive development to draw accurate conclusions. You might have concluded you're not athletic based on being picked last for teams in elementary school, a time when physical development varies wildly, and being picked last says more about timing than capability. You might have concluded you're not smart based on struggling in a particular subject or a particular teaching environment, when intelligence is far more multifaceted than performance in one domain. You might have concluded you're not attractive based on rejection or criticism during adolescence, possibly the worst possible time to draw conclusions about your appearance, given how much everyone is changing and how cruel peer dynamics can be. These conclusions were understandable given the limited perspective available when they were formed, but they were never accurate assessments of your inherent nature or fixed potential. They were snapshots of a particular moment, interpreted through the lens of a developing brain that was trying to make sense of painful or confusing experiences. Yet you've been treating them as immutable truth ever since, organizing your choices and behaviors around them, never questioning whether they might be fundamentally wrong. Breaking the belief barrier begins with identifying your limiting beliefs. This is harder than it sounds because, as mentioned, beliefs don't announce themselves as beliefs. They masquerade as reality. But you can identify them by paying attention to your automatic thoughts, especially those that include words like, I can't, I'm not, I'll never, I always, or people like me don't. These phrases usually signal underlying beliefs that are constraining your sense of possibility. Another way to identify limiting beliefs is to notice areas where you consistently avoid taking action despite claiming you want different results. If you say you want a relationship, but never put yourself in situations where you might meet someone, there's likely a belief underneath like, I'm not attractive enough, or relationships never work out for me, or I'll just get hurt. If you say you want to change careers, but never take steps toward it, there might be beliefs like, I'm too old, or I don't have what it takes, or it's too risky. The gap between what you say you want and what you actually do reveals beliefs that are running the show beneath your conscious awareness. Once you've identified a limiting belief, the next step is to examine the evidence for it. Not casually, but systematically, like a scientist testing a hypothesis. What actual evidence do you have that this belief is true? When you look closely, you'll usually find that the evidence is far thinner than you assumed. You might have a handful of experiences that seem to confirm the belief, but when you really examine them, they're often ambiguous, explainable in multiple ways, or from so long ago that their relevance to your current self is questionable. Equally important is examining the evidence against the belief, the counterexamples that don't fit your conclusion. If you believe you're not creative, have there been times when you solved problems in innovative ways? Made something original? Had ideas that others found interesting? If you believe you're bad at relationships, Have there been relationships or friendships where you connected well? Times when you were supportive, loving, or emotionally available? Most limiting beliefs are sustained by selective attention to confirming evidence while dismissing or not even noticing disconfirming evidence. Deliberately focusing on counterexamples weakens the belief's grip. Another powerful technique is to question the logical structure of the belief itself. Many limiting beliefs contain logical fallacies that you've never examined. I failed at this in the past, therefore I'll always fail, is a logical error. Past performance doesn't determine future results, especially when conditions change. I'm not naturally good at this, therefore I can't develop skill at it, is false. Most capabilities are developed through practice, not present from birth. People like me don't succeed at this is often based on a small sample size or outdated information and ignores individual variation within groups. Beyond logical examination, you can conduct behavioral experiments that directly test the belief. If you believe you're not capable of doing something, try doing it in a low-stakes context and observe what actually happens rather than what you predicted would happen. Often, you'll discover that your belief was simply wrong. You are capable. It's not as difficult as you imagine. Or even if it's challenging, you can handle the challenge better than you expected. These experiential disconfirmations are more powerful than logical arguments because they provide direct evidence that contradicts the belief. One of the most liberating realizations is that even if a belief was once true, it doesn't have to remain true. Maybe you genuinely weren't good at something when you tried it years ago. That doesn't mean you wouldn't be good at it now, with more maturity, different circumstances, or dedicated practice. Maybe you genuinely did struggle in certain areas as a child. That doesn't mean those struggles are permanent. The brain's neuroplasticity means that you can develop capacities that weren't present before. You're not fixed, you're developing. And that means that your past doesn't determine your future unless you allow it to, by maintaining beliefs that are no longer valid. Some limiting beliefs can be released simply by recognizing them as beliefs rather than facts, and choosing to adopt alternative beliefs that serve you better. But deeply rooted beliefs, especially those formed in childhood or through trauma, often require more intensive work. They're not just cognitive, they're embodied, connected to emotional and somatic patterns that reinforce them. These beliefs might need to be addressed through therapy, somatic work, or other approaches that engage the whole system rather than just the thinking mind. As you systematically identify and challenge your limiting beliefs, you'll notice something remarkable. Your sense of what's possible begins to expand. Options that seemed completely off the table suddenly seem viable. Goals that felt impossible begin to feel achievable. Your cage is getting larger, or more accurately, you're recognizing that the bars were never as solid as they seemed. This expansion creates momentum because each belief you break through makes it easier to question other beliefs. You develop confidence in your capacity to transcend limitations that once seemed absolute. And this confidence itself becomes a meta-belief that supports ongoing liberation. Chapter 4. The fear that imprisons fear is the guardian of your invisible cage. It's the mechanism that keeps you from even approaching the bars, let alone questioning whether they're solid. Every limitation you've accepted, every piece of potential you've left untapped, every dream you've abandoned is protected by fear. Not necessarily the rational fear of genuine danger, but psychological fear, the anticipation of discomfort, rejection, failure, judgment, or loss that keeps you playing small and staying safe within familiar boundaries. Understanding the nature of fear is essential for liberation because most people relate to fear completely backwards. They think fear is a signal that something is dangerous and should be avoided. They believe that the presence of fear means they're about to make a mistake, that they should turn back, that they're not ready. But this interpretation of fear keeps you trapped forever, because growth always involves fear. Anything new, anything beyond your current comfort zone, anything that challenges your existing identity will generate fear. If you wait until you're not afraid to pursue what matters, you'll wait forever. The truth about fear is that it's information, not instruction. It tells you that something feels significant or risky to your nervous system. But your nervous system can't distinguish between real danger and psychological discomfort. It responds to the possibility of rejection with the same alarm it would respond to a physical threat. It activates when you're about to speak your truth with the same intensity it would activate if you were about to be attacked. Your fear response is a sensitive alarm system that errs on the side of caution, which was useful for survival in ancestral environments, but is often counterproductive in modern life, where most threats are social and psychological rather than physical. Dr. Susan Jeffers captured this brilliantly in her book titled Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. The fear doesn't have to go away before you take action. You can act despite fear, through fear, with fear as a companion rather than as an obstacle. In fact, the presence of fear is often a sign that you're doing something that matters, something that could genuinely change your life, something worth being afraid of. The absence of fear usually means you're staying so safely within your comfort zone that nothing significant is at stake. But most people have developed what psychologists call experiential avoidance. They organize their lives around not feeling uncomfortable emotions, including fear. They make decisions based not on what would be most aligned with their values or dreams, but on what will minimize anxiety and discomfort. They turn down opportunities that excite them because they're also scary. They stay in situations that make them miserable because leaving would require facing fear of the unknown. They suppress their authentic expression because being real might trigger fear of rejection. The avoidance of fear becomes the primary organizing principle of their lives, which guarantees a life that's safe but small. This fear avoidance creates a vicious cycle. The more you avoid what you fear, the more powerful the fear becomes. Your avoidance teaches your nervous system that the thing you're avoiding must indeed be dangerous, which intensifies the fear response next time you consider approaching it. Meanwhile, you never gather evidence that the feared outcome might not be as catastrophic as you imagine because you never let yourself experience it. The fear grows in the darkness of avoidance, becoming a monster that's far more terrifying than the reality would be. The liberation method requires reversing this dynamic. Instead of avoiding fear, you gradually learn to approach it, to move toward what scares you in measured, intentional ways. This doesn't mean recklessly throwing yourself into terrifying situations. It means systematically expanding your comfort zone by deliberately doing things that generate mild to moderate fear while you have sufficient resources to handle them. Each time you approach fear and survive, you teach your nervous system that the feared situation isn't actually as dangerous as it believed. The fear gradually loses its power. This process is called exposure in clinical psychology, and it's the most effective treatment for anxiety and phobias. But it works for any fear-based limitation. If you fear public speaking, you start by speaking in front of small, safe groups and gradually work up to larger, more challenging contexts. If you fear rejection, you deliberately put yourself in situations where rejection is possible and discover that you can handle it. If you fear failure, you undertake projects where failure is a real possibility and learn that failing doesn't destroy you. Each exposure builds your confidence and reduces the fear's grip. One of the most important distinctions in working with fear is recognizing the difference between fear and danger. Danger is an objective assessment of potential harm. Fear is a subjective emotional response that may or may not correspond to actual danger. You can feel terrified in situations that are perfectly safe, like speaking in front of a friendly audience. And you can feel calm in situations that are genuinely dangerous if your fear response has been dampened through familiarity or dissociation. Learning to distinguish "I feel afraid" from "I am in danger" is crucial because it allows you to override your fear response when you've assessed that the situation is actually safe, despite how it feels. Another crucial insight is that much of what you fear isn't actually the event itself, but your belief about whether you could handle it. You're not afraid of rejection. You're afraid you couldn't cope with the emotional pain of rejection. You're not afraid of failure. You're afraid you'd be devastated by failure and unable to recover. You're not afraid of change. You're afraid you lack the resilience to adapt to new circumstances. But these fears about your coping capacity are usually unfounded. You've handled difficult emotions before. You've recovered from setbacks. You've adapted to changes. Your track record of surviving challenging situations is actually 100%. You've made it through every difficulty you've encountered so far. Recognizing your own resilience is powerfully liberating. When you remember that you've survived everything life has thrown at you, that you've found ways to cope with pain, loss, rejection, and failure, that you've adapted to changes you didn't choose and circumstances you didn't want, you realize that you're far more capable of handling difficulty than your fear gives you credit for. This recognition doesn't eliminate fear, but it changes your relationship to it. Fear becomes less of a stop sign and more of a sensation you can experience while still moving forward. Some fears are protecting you from real consequences that deserve consideration. The fear of financial ruin if you quit your job without a plan is reasonable and worth heeding. The fear of physical harm in genuinely dangerous situations is your survival instinct working properly. But even these reasonable fears shouldn't be automatic decision makers. They should be information you factor into your decision making alongside other considerations like your values, your long-term vision, and your assessment of what's at stake. Fear gets a voice, but not a veto. The deepest liberation from fear comes when you shift your primary fear from the fear of discomfort to the fear of an unlived life. What if the thing you should be most afraid of isn't failure, rejection, judgment, or any of the psychological fears that currently constrain you? What if the thing to be truly afraid of is reaching the end of your life and realizing you never took the risks that could have led to genuine fulfillment? That you stayed safe but small? that you protected yourself from possible pain, but also from possible joy, that you died with your music still in you, as Oliver Wendell Holmes warned. When your fear of regret becomes stronger than your fear of discomfort, liberation becomes inevitable because you're no longer willing to let fear determine how you live. Chapter 5. The Power of Intention. Most people drift through life reacting to circumstances rather than consciously creating from intention. They respond to whatever comes their way, making decisions based on what's comfortable, familiar, or expected, rather than on what they genuinely want to create. This reactive approach produces lives that happen to people rather than lives that are deliberately crafted. But human beings have a unique capacity that most never fully utilize: the power of intention. The ability to consciously direct your attention, energy, and action toward outcomes that matter to you. Intention is different from wishing, hoping, or wanting. Those are passive states where you desire something but aren't committed to bringing it into reality. Intention is active, committed, focused energy directed toward a specific outcome. When you set a clear intention, you're not just expressing a preference. You're making a declaration about what you're going to create and organizing your choices and actions around that creation. Intention is the bridge between potential and actuality, between what could be and what will be. The power of intention has been recognized across wisdom traditions for millennia, but modern psychology and neuroscience are now revealing the mechanisms through which it works. When you set a clear intention, your brain's reticular activating system begins filtering your perception to notice opportunities, resources, and information relevant to your intention that you would have otherwise missed. You start seeing possibilities that were always there but invisible to you because they weren't relevant to your focus. This isn't magical. It's just how attention works. You can't consciously process all the information available in your environment, so your brain filters based on what's important to you. Intention defines what's important. Dr. Gabriele Oettingen's research on motivation reveals something crucial about effective intention setting. Positive fantasizing about desired outcomes actually reduces motivation and achievement. When you only imagine the wonderful results you want, your brain gets some of the satisfaction without having to do the work, which paradoxically makes you less likely to pursue the goal. But when you combine positive vision of the desired outcome with realistic assessment of obstacles, something she calls mental contrasting, you activate both the motivation to pursue the goal and the problem-solving needed to overcome obstacles. Effective intention holds both the vision and the realistic challenges in awareness simultaneously. Setting powerful intentions requires clarity about what you actually want, not what you think you should want, not what others want for you, not what would look impressive, but what genuinely matters to you. This is harder than it sounds, because most people have been trained to suppress their authentic desires in favor of acceptable ones. You learn early to want what's realistic, appropriate, or aligned with others' expectations rather than what would genuinely fulfill you. Getting clear about authentic intention requires cutting through layers of conditioning to find what's true beneath. One way to access authentic intention is to ask yourself what you would pursue if you knew you couldn't fail, if judgment and criticism weren't factors, if money weren't a constraint. When you remove the practical concerns temporarily, what emerges? That emergence points toward authentic desire, though you'll still need to figure out how to bridge from where you are to where you want to be. But you can't create effective strategies if you're not clear about the actual destination. Another approach is to imagine yourself at the end of your life looking back. What would you regret not having tried? What would you wish you'd given yourself permission to pursue? What would you want to have contributed, created, or experienced? This perspective often cuts through the fears and shoulds that cloud your vision, revealing what genuinely matters to you beneath the noise of daily concerns and social expectations. Once you have clarity about your intention, the next step is declaration. There's power in stating your intention clearly, both to yourself and ideally to others who can support your pursuit. This declaration makes the intention real in a way that keeping it as a vague hope never does. You're putting a stake in the ground, committing publicly, creating accountability. This declaration activates your identity in alignment with the intention. You begin to see yourself as someone who is pursuing this rather than someone who wishes they could. But intention without aligned action is just fantasy. The power of intention manifests through the daily choices and behaviors that either support or undermine what you've declared. If your intention is to write a book, but you never actually write, the intention is empty. If your intention is to create a relationship, but you never put yourself in situations where you might meet someone, the intention accomplishes nothing. Intention must be backed by consistent action, even small action, that moves you incrementally toward what you're creating. This is where most people fail with intention setting. They set the intention with great energy and enthusiasm, maybe even take some initial actions, but then encounter obstacles, discomfort, or competing demands, and gradually drift away from the intention. The initial energy fades, other priorities take over, and eventually the intention becomes just another abandoned goal. Sustaining intention requires commitment beyond initial enthusiasm. It requires showing up and taking aligned action even when you don't feel motivated, even when progress is slow, even when obstacles seem overwhelming. One practice that supports sustained intention is regular review and renewal. Daily or weekly, you reconnect with your intention, remember why it matters, visualize the outcome, and recommit to the actions that support it. This regular renewal prevents the intention from fading into the background of your awareness, where it loses its power to organize your choices. You're keeping it active, vital, present in your decision-making. Intention also becomes more powerful when it's connected to your deeper values rather than just surface desires. If your intention is to make money, that's fine, but it becomes more compelling and sustainable when you connect it to the underlying value. Maybe money represents freedom, security, the ability to contribute, or the means to pursue creativity without financial pressure. When you connect to the value beneath the intention, you tap into deeper motivation that can sustain you through challenges that would derail a superficial intention. The liberation method recognizes that living from intention rather than reaction is itself a form of freedom. You're no longer at the mercy of circumstances, pushed around by whatever happens to occur. You're actively shaping your life, consciously creating outcomes that matter to you, using your limited time and energy deliberately rather than letting them be consumed by default. This shift from reactive to creative living is fundamental to accessing your potential, because potential is only realized through intentional expression. If you're just reacting, you're only using the narrow range of capabilities needed to handle whatever comes your way. When you're intentionally creating, you draw on capabilities you didn't even know you had. Chapter 6. Reclaiming your energy. Energy is your most precious resource. Not time, not money, but energy. The vitality, focus, and life force that allows you to engage with your existence. Without energy, all the time in the world is useless. With abundant energy, you can accomplish remarkable things in limited time. Yet most people are energy depleted, running on empty, chronically exhausted in ways that go beyond physical tiredness into emotional, mental, and spiritual depletion. This energy crisis isn't primarily a physical problem requiring more sleep or better diet, though those help. It's an energy management problem where your precious vitality is being drained by relationships, activities, thoughts, and patterns that don't serve you. Understanding energy requires recognizing that it flows in both directions. Things either give you energy or take energy from you. People either energize you or drain you. Activities either rejuvenate you or deplete you. Thoughts either enliven you or exhaust you. Environments either support your vitality or diminish it. And yet most people never consciously evaluate their lives through this lens. They commit to relationships because they should, engage in activities because they're expected, maintain thoughts because they're habitual, and stay in environments because they're familiar, all while wondering why they're constantly exhausted. Energy drains come in many forms. Toxic relationships, where you're constantly managing someone else's emotions, walking on eggshells, or giving without receiving drain enormous energy. Work that doesn't align with your values or utilize your strengths depletes you even when it's not physically demanding. Environments that are chaotic, cluttered, or aesthetically unpleasant require constant low-level stress that accumulates over time. Chronic worry and rumination burn through mental energy without producing any useful results. Suppressing your authentic expression and maintaining a false self requires constant energy to sustain the performance. One of the biggest energy drains is decision fatigue. Every choice you make, no matter how small, consumes mental energy. This is why successful people often create routines and systems that eliminate unnecessary decisions. Wearing the same clothes, eating similar meals, following established patterns for parts of their day that don't require creativity. They're conserving decision-making energy for the choices that actually matter. But most people's lives are filled with countless small decisions that could be automated or eliminated, constantly draining the energy needed for significant choices and creative work. Another major energy drain is unfinished business. Projects started and not completed. Conversations needed but not had. Decisions deferred but not forgotten. Each piece of unfinished business occupies a small amount of mental RAM, consuming processing power even when you're not consciously thinking about it. When you have dozens or hundreds of these open loops, they create a background hum of anxiety and overwhelm that constantly depletes you. Completing, canceling, or delegating these open loops liberates enormous energy. Reclaiming your energy begins with an honest audit of where your energy actually goes. Track your energy levels throughout a typical week, noticing when you feel energized and when you feel drained. What activities enliven you and what depletes you? Which people you feel good after spending time with and which leave you exhausted? This tracking reveals patterns that are invisible when you're just moving through your days on autopilot. You might discover that activities you thought you enjoyed are actually draining you. or that people you feel obligated to spend time with are major energy vampires. Once you've identified the major drains, the liberation work is consciously reducing or eliminating them where possible and managing them better where they're unavoidable. This might mean setting boundaries with energy-draining people, reducing time spent on obligations that don't align with your values, decluttering your physical environment, addressing unfinished business, or changing jobs if work is the primary drain. Some of these changes feel difficult or impossible, but that's usually because you haven't yet weighed the true cost of continuing to tolerate the drain against the cost of making the change. Equally important is consciously increasing your engagement with what energizes you. Most people have forgotten what actually gives them energy because they've been ignoring their authentic preferences for so long. They can tell you what they're supposed to enjoy, what others enjoy, what productive people do, but they've lost touch with what genuinely nourishes them. Reconnecting with your energy sources requires experimentation, trying different activities, and noticing your actual response rather than your conceptual assumption about what you should enjoy. Energy sources are deeply individual. For some people, social interaction is energizing. For others, it's depleting even when enjoyable, requiring careful management and sufficient alone time to recharge. For some, physical activity generates energy. For others, it consumes it. For some, creative work is rejuvenating. For others, it's exhausting. There's no universal prescription. You have to know yourself well enough to understand what nourishes you specifically, and then prioritize it regardless of whether it matches cultural norms about what you're supposed to find energizing. Physical energy management is foundational because mental and emotional energy depend on it. Sleep, nutrition, movement, and stress management aren't optional if you want to access your potential. Chronic sleep deprivation alone can reduce your cognitive function to the equivalent of being legally drunk. Poor nutrition creates energy spikes and crashes that make sustained focus impossible. Sedentary lifestyle leads to physical depletion that manifests as mental fog. Unmanaged stress keeps your nervous system in constant activation that burns through energy without producing anything useful. But beyond basic physical maintenance, there's spiritual energy, the sense of meaning, purpose, and connection that provides a different quality of vitality than physical energy. You can be physically tired, but spiritually energized, sustained by the significance of what you're doing. Or you can be physically rested, but spiritually depleted, empty despite adequate sleep and nutrition. This spiritual energy comes from living in alignment with your values, contributing to something beyond yourself, experiencing beauty and awe, connecting deeply with others, and engaging in activities that feel meaningful rather than just productive. One of the most powerful energy reclamation practices is learning to say no. Most people are massively overcommitted, having said yes to obligations, relationships, and activities that drain far more than they give. They said yes because they felt they should, because someone asked, and they couldn't think of a good reason to decline, because they didn't want to disappoint anyone, because they hadn't yet learned that no is a complete sentence. But every yes to something that doesn't serve you is a no to something that could. Every commitment to an energy drain is energy not available for what genuinely matters. Learning to say no without guilt or excessive explanation is a crucial liberation skill. You don't owe anyone a justification for declining requests that don't align with your priorities. No, that doesn't work for me is sufficient. I'm not available for that is complete. I need to decline requires no further elaboration. Most people's discomfort with saying no comes from learned people-pleasing patterns, where they believe their role is to accommodate others regardless of personal cost. But this is a guaranteed path to depletion and resentment. As you reclaim your energy through eliminating drains and increasing sources, you'll notice something remarkable. You have far more capacity than you realized. You're not fundamentally limited or inadequate. You were just running your life in a way that constantly depleted you, making it impossible to access your potential. With reclaimed energy, goals that seemed impossible become achievable. Projects you've been procrastinating on suddenly get completed. Relationships improve because you have energy to bring to them. Creativity flows because you're not trying to squeeze it from an empty tank. This isn't about working harder. It's about managing your energy wisely so you have what you need when you need it. Chapter 7. The Practice of Presence. One of the most overlooked aspects of liberation is presence, the capacity to be fully here, now, engaged with what's actually happening rather than lost in thoughts about past or future. Most people spend the majority of their waking hours not present at all. They're physically here, but mentally elsewhere, reviewing what happened, planning what's next, worrying about possible futures, fantasizing about different circumstances. This chronic absence from the present moment is itself a form of imprisonment, because the present is the only place where life actually happens, where choice is available, where change can occur. Your mind's tendency to wander isn't random. It's generally wandering toward perceived problems, either trying to fix the past through rumination or control the future through worry and planning. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Ancestors who spent mental energy anticipating threats and learning from mistakes probably survived better than those who lived entirely in the moment. But in modern life, where most threats are psychological rather than physical, and where the mind's problem-solving rarely produces useful solutions to emotional difficulties, this constant mental time travel creates suffering without providing commensurate benefit. Dr. Matt Killingsworth's research using an iPhone app that randomly pinged people throughout their days to ask what they were doing and whether their mind was wandering, found that people's minds wander about 47% of the time, and that this mind wandering consistently predicts unhappiness. It's not that unhappy people's minds wander more. It's that mind wandering itself creates unhappiness regardless of what you're doing. You could be engaged in pleasant activities, but if your mind is elsewhere, you experience less joy than you would if you were present. The liberation that comes from presence is profound because it breaks the tyranny of past and future. When you're truly present, the past has no power over you. It's not here. Only the memory of it is here, and that memory has only as much significance as you give it in this moment. When you're truly present, the future has no power over you either. It hasn't happened. Only your imagination of it exists, and that imagination is happening now and can be changed now. All your suffering about past and future is actually happening in the present, generated by present moment thinking about non-present events. This doesn't mean the past is irrelevant or that you shouldn't plan for the future. It means that thinking about past and future is something you do in the present, and you can choose when to engage in it deliberately rather than being lost in it compulsively. You can decide, Now I'm going to reflect on that past experience to extract learning, and then do so consciously. You can decide, now I'm going to plan for tomorrow, and engage in useful planning. But then you return to presence, rather than staying lost in mental time travel. The past and future become tools you use consciously, rather than prisons that hold you unconsciously. Developing presence requires practice, because your mind's habit of wandering is deeply ingrained. Meditation is the most direct training in presence, literally practicing bringing your attention back to the present moment repeatedly as the mind wanders. But presence can be practiced in any activity. Eating can be done with full attention to taste, texture, temperature. Walking can be done with awareness of body sensation and environmental stimuli. Conversation can be conducted with genuine listening rather than planning what you'll say next. Any activity becomes a presence practice when you bring your full attention to it. One of the obstacles to presence is the belief that presence means having a quiet mind, no thoughts, perfect peace. This misunderstanding causes people to conclude they can't be present or meditate because their mind is too active. But presence isn't the absence of thoughts. It's awareness of thoughts without being lost in them. You can have thoughts arising and still be present by recognizing I'm having a thought, rather than believing you are the thought. The difference is subtle, but transformative. You shift from being inside the thought, identified with it, to observing the thought from a place that's not captured by it. Another powerful presence practice is engaging your senses fully. Your thinking mind pulls you into past and future, but your senses only function in the present. You can't see yesterday or taste tomorrow. When you bring attention to what you're sensing right now, what you're seeing, hearing, feeling on your skin, smelling, tasting, you anchor yourself in present reality. This is why practices like mindful eating or walking meditation are so effective. They give you a concrete present moment anchor that interrupts the mind's habitual wandering. Presence also transforms your relationship to emotions. When you're present with an emotion, rather than lost in thoughts about it, you discover that emotions are actually just sensations, energy moving through your body. It's the thoughts about the emotion, the story you tell about what it means, the resistance to experiencing it, that creates suffering. But the raw sensation of emotion, when experienced directly without story, is manageable and temporary. It arises, peaks, and passes, usually within minutes, if you don't feed it with rumination. This direct experience of emotion is liberating because it reveals that you're far more capable of handling difficult feelings than you believed. You've been avoiding emotions not because the sensations themselves are unbearable, but because the story you tell about them is terrifying. If I let myself feel this sadness, I'll fall apart is a story, not a fact. When you actually feel the sadness without the catastrophic story, you discover that you don't fall apart. You feel sad, and then the sadness passes, and you're still intact. This discovery builds emotional resilience that expands what you're willing to attempt in life. Presence is also the state in which flow occurs. Flow is that optimal state where you're completely absorbed in what you're doing, losing track of time, performing at your best with apparent effortlessness. Flow can't occur when you're distracted, when part of your attention is elsewhere. It requires total presence, full engagement with what's right in front of you. People who experience frequent flow states report significantly higher life satisfaction than those who don't. And presence is the gateway to flow. The liberation method recognizes presence not as a pleasant but optional practice, but as essential for accessing your potential. When you're not present, you're not actually living your life. You're existing in a kind of trance, mechanically going through motions while your real attention is elsewhere. The moments you're not present are moments you don't really experience, moments that pass without you truly inhabiting them. And since your life is made of moments, every moment spent absent is life unlived. Presence is how you reclaim your life from the tyranny of mental time travel and become available to actually experience what's happening. Chapter 8. Liberating your creativity. Creativity isn't a special talent that some people have and others don't. It's a fundamental human capacity that's been suppressed in most people through education, socialization, and the internalization of narrow definitions of what counts as creative. Every child is naturally creative, endlessly imaginative, willing to experiment and play and make things that don't yet exist. But by adulthood, most people have concluded that they're not creative, that creativity belongs to artists and special people, that their role is to consume what creative people make rather than create themselves. This suppression of creativity is a form of imprisonment, because creativity is how you bring new possibilities into reality. It's how you solve problems that don't have established solutions. It's how you express what's unique about your perspective and experience. It's how you contribute something to the world that wouldn't exist without you. When your creativity is suppressed, you're limited to reproducing what already exists, following templates, staying within established patterns. You can be competent and successful in conventional terms, but you can't access the potential that's truly yours, because that potential is unique and therefore requires creative expression. The suppression usually begins in school, where creativity is systematically discouraged in favor of getting the right answer. Education focuses on convergent thinking, finding the single correct solution to well-defined problems. Creativity requires divergent thinking, generating multiple possible solutions, exploring ambiguity, tolerating uncertainty. Children learn quickly that creative responses to questions are often marked wrong, that following instructions is rewarded, while innovation is punished, unless it occurs in narrowly defined creative domains like art class. By the time they reach adulthood, most people have internalized the message that creativity is not for them. Cultural conditioning reinforces this suppression. You're taught to be practical, realistic, sensible. Dreams are dismissed as naive. Experimentation is seen as wasteful. Failure in creative attempts is mocked rather than recognized as essential to the creative process. You learn that the safe path is to find out what already works and do that, to follow proven formulas, to let others be the creative ones while you focus on being productive and responsible. This conditioning creates adults who are competent executors but incapable of innovation, able to follow but unable to lead into genuinely new territory. The liberation of your creativity begins with recognizing that the judgments you've internalized about your creative capacity are not facts. "I'm not creative" is a conclusion you drew based on narrow definitions of creativity and possibly on criticism you received for creative attempts. But creativity shows up in countless ways beyond art. The way you solve problems is creative. The way you approach relationships is creative. The way you organize your life is creative. Cooking a meal without a recipe is creative. Finding a new route when the usual one is blocked is creative. Making people laugh is creative. Creativity is simply bringing something into existence that wasn't there before. And you do this constantly without recognizing it as creativity. One of the most powerful creativity practices is removing the judgment of good or bad from creative output. The harsh inner critic that immediately evaluates everything you create, declaring it not good enough, is the primary obstacle to creative flow. This critic was installed by early experiences of criticism, comparison, or perfectionism, and it now operates automatically, shutting down creative impulses before they can even fully form. But creative flow requires suspending judgment during the creation process. You can't simultaneously create and criticize. They're incompatible modes. This is why many creative practices include a stage of pure generation without editing. Writers do rough drafts without worrying about quality. Brainstorming explicitly prohibits criticism of ideas during the idea generation phase. Improvisation in theater or music requires saying yes to whatever emerges without judgment. These practices recognize that creativity requires a state of openness and permission that judgment destroys. You can edit later, but you have to create first, and creation requires silencing the inner critic temporarily. Another crucial insight is that creativity requires making bad things. Every creative person who produces work you admire has also produced enormous amounts of work that wasn't good. The good work emerged from the willingness to create without knowing whether it would be good, to experiment and fail, to make things that don't work in service of discovering what does work. But most people won't allow themselves to make bad things. They wait until they're sure they can make something good, which means they never start, or they abandon creative projects the moment they realize the output isn't meeting their standards. This is backwards. You don't wait until you're good to start creating. You create in order to get good. Your first attempts will likely be mediocre or worse. This isn't a problem. It's the process. Every master was once a disaster at their craft. The difference is they continued creating through the disaster phase, producing volume, learning from what didn't work, gradually developing skill and taste. But most people quit during the disaster phase, concluding that they lack talent rather than recognizing that they lack practice. Liberating your creativity also requires creating for intrinsic rather than extrinsic reasons. When you create to get something, recognition, money, status, validation, your creativity becomes instrumental and anxiety-producing. You're performing for an audience, trying to produce something that will get you what you want, which constrains your creative exploration to what you think will work. But creativity requires play, exploration, following your curiosity without knowing where it leads. This only happens when you create because the process itself is satisfying, because you're curious about what might emerge, because not creating would feel like self-betrayal. This shift from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation transforms creative practice from pressure to pleasure. You're no longer asking, "Will anyone like this?" or "Is this good enough?" You're asking, "Am I enjoying this? Am I learning? Am I expressing something true?" These questions keep you connected to the process rather than fixated on outcomes, which paradoxically often leads to better outcomes, because you're more willing to experiment, take risks, and follow unexpected directions. Another dimension of creative liberation is recognizing that constraints actually enhance rather than limit creativity. The blank page or empty canvas is often paralyzing, because infinite possibility is overwhelming. But when you introduce constraints, specific rules or limitations, creativity often flourishes. Musicians create within the constraints of keys and time signatures. Poets use structured forms like sonnets or haiku. Designers work within brand guidelines and technical specifications. These constraints provide a framework that paradoxically increases creative freedom by eliminating the paralysis of infinite choice. You can deliberately use constraints to unlock your creativity. Give yourself arbitrary rules. Write a story using only 500 words. Create something using only materials you already have. Solve a problem without the most obvious solution. These constraints force your brain out of habitual patterns and into creative problem-solving mode. They make the practice playful rather than pressured, which is the state where creativity flows most naturally. The ultimate creative liberation is recognizing that you're unique. Perspective and experience means you have access to creative possibilities that literally don't exist for anyone else. No one else has your exact combination of knowledge, skills, interests, and life experience. This means you're capable of creating connections, solutions, and expressions that are genuinely novel because they emerge from a unique vantage point. But you can only access this unique creativity by being authentically yourself, rather than imitating others or trying to create what you think you should create. When you liberate your creativity, you discover a dimension of yourself that may have been dormant for decades. You remember what it felt like as a child to make things for the pure joy of making them. You access a state of flow where time disappears and effort feels effortless. You contribute something to the world that bears your unique stamp. And you discover that creativity isn't separate from the rest of your life. It infuses everything you do with freshness, possibility, and aliveness. This is what it means to live creatively, not just to make art, but to approach your entire existence as a creative act, where you're constantly bringing new possibilities into reality. Chapter 9. Beyond Self-Improvement to Self-Liberation. The personal development industry has created a massive trap that keeps millions of people stuck in an endless cycle of self-improvement that never quite leads to the freedom they're seeking. You read books, attend seminars, hire coaches, try techniques, make plans, set goals, and achieve some of them. Yet somehow, you never arrive at a place where you feel complete, enough, or truly free. There's always another level to reach, another flaw to fix, another way you're falling short. The self-improvement paradigm itself is the problem because it's based on a fundamentally flawed premise that you're broken and need fixing, that who you currently are is insufficient, and that freedom lies in becoming someone different than you are. The liberation method offers a radically different approach. You're not broken. You're constrained. You don't need fixing. You need freeing. The work isn't to become someone else. It's to remove the obstacles that prevent you from being fully yourself. This shift from improvement to liberation changes everything because it moves you from a paradigm of deficiency to a paradigm of potential. You're not trying to repair yourself. You're trying to unleash what's already there, but currently suppressed. Self-improvement operates from the assumption that there's an ideal version of you that you should be working toward, and that your current self is inadequate in comparison. This creates constant dissatisfaction with who you are now and endless striving toward who you should become. But this ideal is usually a combination of cultural conditioning about what success looks like and compensatory fantasies about being different than you are. It's not actually your potential. It's an imagined self that conforms to external standards while suppressing aspects of your authentic nature that don't fit the ideal. The liberation approach recognizes that your authentic nature, your essence, your potential is already complete. It doesn't need to be created or improved. It needs to be uncovered, expressed, allowed. The work is archaeological, removing layers of conditioning, fear, and false identity that cover over what's already there. You're not building a new self. You're excavating your true self from under the debris of socialization and trauma. This distinction has profound practical implications. Self-improvement asks, what's wrong with me that needs to be fixed? Liberation asks, what's constraining me that needs to be released? Self-improvement creates endless to-do lists of ways you need to change. Liberation creates awareness of beliefs, patterns, and dynamics that can be released. Self-improvement generates shame about current inadequacy. Liberation generates curiosity about what becomes possible when constraints are removed. The self-improvement paradigm also creates what psychologists call spiritual bypassing, using self-development concepts to avoid dealing with real emotional and psychological issues. You might read books about manifestation to avoid acknowledging how your behavior sabotages your success. You might practice positive thinking to suppress legitimate grief or anger. You might pursue enlightenment to escape from the messiness of being human. This bypassing prevents genuine growth because you're using self-improvement to maintain your defenses rather than to dismantle them. Liberation requires the opposite of bypassing. It requires facing what you've been avoiding, feeling what you've been suppressing, acknowledging what you've been denying. It's not comfortable or pretty. It involves grief, anger, fear, shame, and the whole range of emotions that self-improvement often tries to transcend prematurely. But this confrontation with reality is what creates actual freedom. You can't be free from what you won't acknowledge. You can't release what you refuse to feel. The path to liberation goes through the difficulty you've been trying to go around. Another problem with the self-improvement paradigm is that it's fundamentally individualistic, focused on your personal achievement, success, and happiness in ways that can actually reinforce the separation and self-focus that cause suffering. You're constantly working on yourself, analyzing yourself, trying to optimize yourself in ways that paradoxically keep you trapped in self-concern. Liberation recognizes that freedom isn't found in perfecting yourself. It's found in transcending self-focus altogether, in connecting to something larger than your personal story, in contributing to others' well-being and not just your own. This doesn't mean self-care and personal growth aren't important. They are. But they're in service of something larger than personal achievement. Remove your constraints, not just so you can be happier or more successful, but so you can contribute more fully, love more completely, express more authentically, serve more effectively. Your liberation benefits not just you, but everyone your life touches, because a free person naturally uplifts others, while a constrained person, often unconsciously, perpetuates constraint. The shift from self-improvement to liberation also changes your relationship to failure and difficulty. In the self-improvement paradigm, setbacks are evidence that you're not doing it right, that you need to work harder, try a different technique, or maybe that you're fundamentally flawed. But in the liberation paradigm, difficulties are expected parts of the process. When you're dismantling deeply embedded patterns and facing what you've been avoiding, of course it's hard. Of course you'll resist. Of course you'll sometimes revert to old patterns. This isn't failure. It's the terrain of the journey. This compassionate understanding of the difficulty of transformation allows you to stay with the process through challenges that would cause you to give up if you were judging yourself harshly. You can acknowledge, this is really hard, without making it mean you're doing it wrong. You can struggle without concluding you're inadequate. You can take 2 steps forward and 1 step back and recognize this as progress rather than failure. The self-improvement paradigm demands linear progress and interprets anything else as inadequacy. The liberation paradigm recognizes that real growth is messy, non-linear, and includes periods of regression that are actually necessary for integration. Ultimately, the liberation method leads to a place that self-improvement never reaches. You stop trying to be someone else and become completely comfortable being yourself. You stop working on yourself and start living from yourself. You stop pursuing freedom and realize you are freedom. That freedom isn't a state you achieve, but your fundamental nature when constraints are removed. This is the end of the endless self-improvement project, because there's nowhere else to go, nothing else to become. You've arrived at yourself, which was always the destination, even though you didn't know it when you began. Chapter 10. Your liberation begins now. Everything you've learned about the invisible cage, the nature of potential, breaking belief barriers, working with fear, setting intention, reclaiming energy, practicing presence, liberating creativity, and transcending self-improvement culminates in this moment. Not some future moment when you're more ready, when conditions are better, when you figured everything out. This moment. Because liberation isn't a destination you'll reach someday. It's a choice you make now, and now, and now, repeatedly choosing freedom over constraint, authenticity over performance, potential over limitation. The liberation method isn't about following a prescribed formula or working through steps in order. It's about recognizing where you're most constrained and addressing that constraint directly. For some people, the primary prison is limiting beliefs that need systematic dismantling. For others, it's fear that needs gradual exposure and courage. For some, it's energy depletion that needs radical boundary setting and self-care. For others, it's absence of clear intention that needs articulation and commitment. You have to diagnose your particular form of imprisonment to know which liberations are most urgent. But there are universal elements to liberation, regardless of your specific constraints. Awareness is always the starting point. You can't free yourself from what you don't see. The first work is always becoming conscious of the patterns, beliefs, and dynamics that constrain you. This awareness itself is partly liberating because many constraints maintain power only when they operate unconsciously. Once you see them clearly, once you recognize this is a pattern, not reality, this is a belief, not a fact, this is conditioning, not my nature, the constraint has already loosened its grip. From awareness comes choice. When you can see your patterns, you can choose differently. Not easily, not perfectly, not all at once, but you have access to choice that wasn't available when you were operating on autopilot. Every moment of awareness creates a choice point where you can either follow the old pattern or experiment with a new response. Liberation happens in the accumulation of these choices, these moments where you choose freedom over the familiar constraint, even when the constraint feels safer. Liberation also requires action. Understanding your constraints isn't enough. Recognizing your potential isn't sufficient. You have to actually do things differently, put yourself in new situations, try behaviors that feel uncomfortable, challenge beliefs through direct experience. Action creates feedback that either confirms or disconfirms your limiting beliefs. Action builds new neural pathways that make different responses more automatic over time. Action demonstrates to yourself that you're capable of more than you believed. Without action, liberation remains theoretical, an interesting idea that doesn't transform your actual life. The action doesn't have to be dramatic. Grand gestures and radical changes sometimes work, but gradual evolution through small, consistent choices is often more sustainable. You don't have to quit your job tomorrow to begin liberation. You can start by setting one boundary, by saying no to one drain, by pursuing one creative interest, by questioning one limiting belief. These small acts of liberation create momentum. They build your confidence. They prove that change is possible. And they often naturally lead to larger changes as you discover that you're more capable and resilient than you believed. Community and support accelerate liberation because you're working against powerful forces, internalized conditioning, cultural expectations, and sometimes the resistance of people in your life who are invested in keeping you constrained. Having others who understand the journey, who support your growth, who reflect your potential when you can't see it yourself, makes the process less isolating and more sustainable. This might be a therapist, a coach, a peer group, friends who are also committed to growth, or any configuration of support that works for you. But trying to do it entirely alone is usually harder than necessary. The liberation journey also requires accepting that it's ongoing rather than a project you complete. You're not trying to reach a permanently liberated state where you'll never feel constrained again. You're developing the capacity to recognize constraints as they arise and to work with them skillfully. New constraints will emerge as you grow. New fears will appear as you expand your comfort zone. New beliefs will need examination as you venture into territory you haven't explored before. But you'll be approaching these new challenges with increasing skill, confidence, and self-trust, making each subsequent liberation easier than the last. Perhaps most importantly, liberation requires being willing to disappoint people, to be misunderstood, to be criticized, to have people question your choices. Your constraints were often installed to maintain connection, to gain approval, to avoid rejection. Releasing them will sometimes threaten those dynamics. Some people will respond to your liberation with support and celebration. Others will respond with concern, criticism, or attempts to pull you back into familiar patterns. Your commitment to liberation has to be stronger than your need for universal approval. You have to be willing to choose freedom, even when it costs you some people's comfort with who you used to be. This doesn't mean being insensitive or unnecessarily provocative. You can communicate thoughtfully, make changes gradually where appropriate, and maintain relationships while also maintaining boundaries. But ultimately, you cannot make your liberation conditional on everyone else's comfort. Some discomfort, some disruption, some loss is often part of the price of freedom. And it's a price worth paying because the alternative is remaining imprisoned to protect others from the discomfort of your growth. The vision that sustains liberation through its challenges is remembering what becomes possible when you're free. You're not doing this work just to feel better, though you will. You're not pursuing liberation just to be more successful, though you might be. You're liberating yourself so you can actually live before you die, so you can contribute what's yours to give, so you can love without the armor that prevents real connection, so you can create what wants to be expressed through you, so you can be present for the miraculous fact of being alive instead of spending your brief time imprisoned by conditioning and fear. This is your invitation, not to become someone else, not to fix what's wrong with you, not to achieve some impossible ideal, but to become completely, fully, authentically yourself, to remove the constraints and reveal what's been there all along, waiting for permission to emerge, to access the potential that's your birthright, but has been suppressed by layers of conditioning you never consented to live as the free human being you were always meant to be. The method is simple, though not easy. See the cage clearly. Question its reality. Feel the fear and act anyway. Set clear intentions. Reclaim your energy. Practice presence. Express your creativity. Choose liberation over improvement. Take one step, then another, then another. And watch as your life transforms, not into someone else's vision of what you should be, but into your own authentic expression of what it means to be fully alive and free. Your potential is vast. Your constraints are learned. Your freedom is possible. Your liberation begins now, not tomorrow, not when you're ready, not after you've figured everything out. Now, with this breath, with this choice, with this willingness to question one belief, release one constraint, take one action, aligned with who you truly are beneath all the conditioning. The cage door has always been unlocked. You just needed to understand that freedom isn't something you achieve. It's what you are when you stop being everything you're not. Welcome to your liberation,